So this is lecture for chapter 42, which is circulation and gas exchange. So there's a lot of transport systems in your body that are linked. So your circulation and your gas exchange, your respiration are linked. Your heart, your veins, your arteries, and your lungs and all that stuff are linked because they kind of need to work together. Diffusion of gases occurs only among small distances. So basically, in order to have oxygen, for example, or CO2 move, it has to come almost in contact with blood vessels, and that's what happens. Your body is like filled with capillaries and blood vessels that touch basically every organ. So there's basic ways that this contact happens. This is where you have direct contact with the environment. For example, sponges, jellyfish, they basically can exchange gases just right with the water. Another one is gastrovascular cavity. So you have like almost like a vacuole where this exchange happens. This happens with jellies and flatworms. And then the circulatory system is more complex vertebrates. This is when the fluids and tissues exchange gases, and this is what we as mammals do. So your circulatory system is made up of your blood vessels, and your heart. An open circulatory system is when the blood bathes organs directly. It's almost like the organs are sitting in the blood. Closed is where the blood's contained in vessels and pumped around the body, and that's what we have. So in an open system, the blood and the lymph is something called a hemolymph. It's all kind of in one pool. The heart pumps hemolymph into sinuses. This is arthropods, mollusks, clams, most shellfish. In the closed system, the blood and fluid are separate. This is all annelids, cephalopods, vertebrates, anything mostly with a spinal column. That's with a closed system. So this is showing basically where the exchange happens. You have a vein and an artery. The difference is an artery takes blood away, and it's usually oxygenated. A vein takes blood towards the heart, and it's mostly deoxygenated. In between there, you have all these little capillaries where the gas exchange occurs. So arteries, again, blood away. There's a lot of pressure. They're very thick and strong walls. This is where you get your pulse from. Your capillaries connect the arteries and veins. They're single, thick walls. The reason why there's a single wall is because that's where the O2 CO2 exchange happens. And then veins, where the blood flows back to the heart. It's very low pressure. It's thin walled. And valves actually prevent backflow. So you think about the flow going out is easy because the heart's kind of pumping it just like a pump. The veins, it kind of trickles back, but you have all these valves where it kind of almost like a canal where it's going to move through each section and then close. Arterioles are made up of arteries and capillaries. Venules are made up of capillaries and veins. So blood enters the heart through the atrium and is pumped out through the ventricle. I always just think alphabetically, A over V, atrium first, then ventricle. In fish, there's a single circulation pathway, 2 chambers. In most things like us mammals, there's double circulation where there's more than 2 chambers. So this is just comparing circulation paths. Double circulation paths, you have kind of it going out one way and in another way. That's the double. So you see in each of these animals, you have the red oxygenated blood coming out one chamber and the blue deoxygenated blood coming in the other chamber. The pathway through the heart is always a big thing. The blood basically comes in through the heart right here. It's going to come down into the first atrium. It's going to go down into the right ventricle. It's going to go through a valve. It goes up into, the left atrium, and then it's going to go back in, and then it comes back out. So remember, the deoxygenated blood comes in from your veins. The oxygenated blood goes out through your arteries. Then from there, it kind of circulates everywhere. Your body goes everywhere. There's lots of capillaries that take it to the lungs. That's where the gas exchange happens. And then all these capillaries, veins, and arteries go everywhere throughout their whole body. Your cardiac cycle is the cycle of your heartbeats. You have a systole, which is the contraction, and a diastole, which is the relaxation. So in the contraction, the blood is pumped out, and the diastole, it is relaxed and filling. So what I always think about is if you use a turkey baster, you squeeze the turkey baster, the fluid goes out, and then you let it go, and it will, suck the liquid back in. We've done that with our disposable pipettes in class. When you get a blood pressure, you're going to get a systole over a diastole. So the normal is 120 over 80, and that's the normal heartbeat. The heart rate is the number of beats per minute. For normal fit humans, it should be 72 at rest. So you've been sitting or laying for a while and you take your heart rate, it should be about 72 beats per minute. Anything under that is really good. Anything over that, you're starting to get your heart's pumping a little bit too quickly. Your stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle during contraction. It should be about 70 milliliters. If it's below that, what happens is your ventricle's not pumping enough, and then your heart will have to pump extra to get to kind of compensate. So this is just showing you the time it takes for your heart to pump. It does not take very long. If you've ever felt your heartbeat, it's like a boom, boom, thud, thud right after each other. Valves prevent backflow. The atrioventricle valve, tricuspid, bicuspid, separate the atrium and the ventricle. It's going to keep the blood from going backwards. The semilunar valves control blood flow to the aorta and the pulmonary aorta. This is where you get the lub-dub sound. This is when the blood's going against the closed valves. And a heart murmur is when those valves don't shut completely, so you do get some backflow of blood, and it's a little bit of a defect in the heart. It's not bad. Sometimes it fixes itself. It actually can fix, and then sometimes you have to go in and fix the valves. Sinoatrial SA node is a pacemaker for the heart and the right atrium. Your heart basically pumps in rhythm. It's a electrical impulse. That's why when you see, if you're on a heart monitor in the hospital, it's a beep, beep, beep. It's actually getting the beep of your heart rate. EKG, for example, is measuring that, and that's what that is. Your blood pressure is basically the force through which the blood is being pushed through your veins. If it's too low, your blood is not getting as far. It's not going to reach your feet, for example, or things that are far away from your heart. If your blood pressure is too high, it can actually burst your veins. So that's why we want to keep it between 120 and 70. Remember, systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. And the pulse is your rhythmic bulging of your arteries with each heartbeat, and you can measure the amount of times that's happening, and then there's a certain rate, about 70 beats per minute, that it should happen. A sphygmometer, a very weird sounding thing, that is what they take your blood pressure with. What they essentially do is take this cuff, they increase the pressure around the cuff with air until it cuts off the circulation in your arm. That's why your arm sometimes gets tingly, and then they slowly let it go, and they measure at what point the blood's going to flow through, and that's how they get your blood pressure. So they're going to close off your artery, they're going to open it, they're going to hear the sound of the blood starting to flow, they measure that pressure, then they hear the sound of when they don't hear basically the blood flowing anymore, and that's your diastole. Most of this is done electronically these days, but doctors and nurses still are trained to do this. The blood returning to the heart through your veins is a very interesting process, because if you think about it, it's going against gravity. So the artery is a little bit easier to understand because it's literally like a pump sending it through, has some pressure behind it. But the veins, it's kind of weird. It shouldn't happen. So what happens with the veins is it kind of goes against gravity, and then it has these valves all along the veins. And as the blood's going through, it pumps through and then it stops. But then since the valve closes, it's stuck. It can't go backwards. It can only go forwards. Your lymph system returns lost fluid and proteins to the blood. It's a filtering type system. It houses your white blood cells. It helps in your immunity. So it's a really important system. Your blood is actually made up of parts. It's 55% plasma, 45% blood cells and platelets. So plasma is water, ions, proteins, gases, nutrients, waste, hormones. Your cells would be red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. When you get a blood taken, usually they centrifuge it, they separate it, and the plasma actually looks like a whitish, yellowish, mucousy color, and then you can actually see the darker red where the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are. All of these develop from the stem cells in the bone marrow. Red blood cells are called erythrocytes. They help transfer O2 with hemoglobin. That's pretty much their only role. White blood cells, remember, fight infection, and then platelets help in blood clotting. Your blood has a very finite concentration of each of these things, and if you're missing one, that's where some issues can arise with blood diseases, they call them. So this is just showing you the elements of blood. It really will look like this. Like I said, the plasma will have a whitish, yellowish color when you separate it. Platelets, remember, help in clotting. They have very interesting, like a web almost design, and they help clot anytime there's a hole in an artery, a vein, on your skin, wherever the blood is escaping. There are several cardiovascular diseases that can happen. Atherosclerosis is the buildup of plaque within arteries. Plaque is never good. This is usually caused by high blood pressure and um, other things that can build up. A heart attack is another term for a myocardial infarction. It's when you get a blockage. So a heart attack is a blockage to an artery for your heart, and it then stops oxygenating your heart, and your heart stops. That's what happens with a heart attack. A stroke is where you get a blockage of an artery in your head, which stops blood flow to your brain. So that's the difference between the two. Hypertension is high blood pressure. It can promote atherosclerosis, and it increases the risk of a heart attack or stroke. Or if you have too much hypertension, your blood pressure is too much, it can actually burst your actual artery. This is showing you plaque buildup. It is going to prevent good blood flow. Cholesterol causes this, and the more, if you can see, the more it's closing, the more it's closing, the more it's closing, it's restricting the blood flow, and then that can be very dangerous to your heart, your health. They actually are developing really cool technologies to get rid of this, to go clear out all these blockages, and they are able to do that now. Respiration is basically breathing. It is exchange of gases. So not only do you have to get O2 to your organs, you have to take the CO2 away, and we call that gas exchange. Partial pressure is the pressure exerted by a particular gas in a mixture. Each gas has its own pressure, so when they mix together, it kind of keeps that pressure. And remember, gases always diffuse or move from higher pressures to lower. The respiratory media is the O2 in air or water. The respiratory surface includes body wall, skin, gills, trachea, whatever it may be in that animal. Usually respiratory surfaces are moist. They have a large surface area to volume ratio, and they're associated with the vascular system in one way. So with aquatic animals, they use gills, and the way gills work is the water moves around the gills, and the oxygen is then taken in that way. Fish gills are very cool. They absorb O2 through a current, so as long as that fish is moving, it is having enough oxygen. And the blood flows the opposite way of the water, so it's kind of cool. Tracheal systems is an insects in us as well. Trachea is like a hole where you're going to get air from the outside that go down into some kind of sac or body cell. With birds, you have lungs and air sacs. Birds have, I guess, a more complicated lung system than us. When they're flying, technically, they can't really breathe because the air pressure is so high, so they have these different air sacs to hold more air. And we call ours mammalian respiratory system. The nasal cavity, the mouth, the esophagus, the larynx, trachea, that all brings air in. We have right lung and left lung, diaphragm that helps us move. So oxygen starts with the nose and mouth. It is filtered, warmed, and humidified. So it's kind of cool to think about. That's what the purpose of your nose is. It has hairs and snot, and all those things help to warm it and humidify it. The pharynx connects the nose and mouth to the esophagus. The larynx is where your vocal cords are. The trachea is your windpipe, lined with cartilage. Trachea is where food usually gets lodged. That's where we have to do the Heimlich to get it out. Bronchi are branches to lungs. Bronchioles are smaller branches in the lungs. Alveoli are very small air sacs where gas exchange occurs. Mucus helps traps particles and keeps things like nastiness from getting into the lungs, and cilia, sweet particles, up to the pharynx. So your alveoli are these little, that's kind of what makes lungs up. They're little balls or packages where the capillaries run, which is going to help exchange the air. So you see, you inhale, you take in oxygen, it travels from your trachea all the way down to your pulmonary, to your heart, where it gets oxygenated, and then it gets expelled, the CO2 gets expelled. The way you breathe is actually interesting. It's not so much that you're inhaling, it's your diaphragm in your chest pulls your lungs up and sucks in the air. So your diaphragm in your chest, it's a muscle. If you feel it, it's on top of your chest. When you take a breath in, that moves up because your body's actually inhaling that way. It's a dome-shaped muscle separating the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and that's kind of helps your air, your lungs inflate. The medulla oblongata controls your breathing. It controls the rate of breathing. Breathing is something that you do without thinking about it, unless you do think about it, and then usually you breathe more than you should, but that's what controls your breathing level. It helps respond to pH in the blood. So when you yawn, it's actually because you have high CO2, which is causing your pH to be too low, and then you suck it, you yawn to suck in more oxygen. It's kind of interesting. And sensors in the aorta and carotid arteries help tell your brain, tell your medulla oblongata, oh, we need to breathe more, we need to breathe less. So as you start to run, the oxygen level in your blood will go down because your organs are using it more, and then it kind of the signals go to your brain to breathe quicker, and that's why you usually breathe quicker when you're running. Hemoglobin is a respiratory pigment. It's a heme group. It has iron. It helps carry 4 oxygen molecules everywhere. This works kind of with the pH in your blood as well. Arthropods and mollusks have hemocyanin, which is a blue pigment, contains copper. If you've ever seen, blue lobsters or stuff like that, they actually have blue blood. They don't have red blood. CO2 is transported through bicarbonate ions, hemoglobin, and dissolved in plasma. Remember, CO2 is not good for our body. We don't want it. We try to get rid of it at all costs, and that's the way we get rid of it. Some respiratory disorders, asthma is where you have constricted airways. You do something called wheezing, where you can almost hear the air's not getting through as efficiently as it should. Bronchitis is when your bronchi are swollen and clogged, usually by an infection. You usually need antibiotics to get rid of that. It's actually infected. Pneumonia is inflammation of the lungs caused by an infection. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease caused by a bacterium. This was a huge outbreak of TB in this country, which killed a lot of people, mostly kids. Emphysema is when your lung tissue is less elastic, it's less movable, it can't absorb, take as deep of a breath. Usually that's caused by smoking. And then lung cancer is when you get abnormal cell growth or lumps in your lungs, and again, that's mainly caused by cigarette smoking. And that concludes this lecture.